certain individuals identify with certain things. And a lot of times when we do this, people are thinking automatically race. Well, race is important, obviously, but think outside of race in the ways we identify ourselves. Where you go to church, what social clubs you're involved with. My mother identifies herself by a bingo group that she goes to. She's Catholic and they have bingo. They have a bingo clutch club that she's very close to. And she identifies with that group. You know, they go to movies together and everything. Sometimes it's based on time in terms of age. My mother's going to be 89 years old in September. So she has some things to say about young people. She identifies with a certain age group, you know. Sometimes we identify with the age group. For example, we're fond of saying that individuals who are in their mid-30s or younger are going to be a lot more technically proficient, a lot more into social media. A lot of people identify with Facebook, type of electronic media type thing. So there's a lot of ways in which you can identify with the different cultures. It's broad, and it may be race, gender, but even within race. When I was growing up on the west side of Chicago, we had ways that we identified with each other based on the way that we dressed. On the south side, it was Ivy Leaguers. On the west side, it was Gauchos. You could look at an individual and tell which they were because of the way they dressed. Now, that's kind of superficial, but it went deeper than that. The type of parties you went to, the type of people you identified with, and a lot of different ways other than race. There are individuals who get together who are my age, in your early 60s, that have a lot more things in common. You know, I like to follow little white balls on courses through the woods, you know, because that's where I spend most of my time. You know, the things you identify in different ways, and you could form cultures around those things. But when you come down to it, there are certain things that you pursue, and a lot of times when we do this, it's because of the things that we believe in. You know, we get together with community groups to do certain things, to advance certain causes. It's because we believe in certain things and we have that commonality. Well, that commonality in beliefs, those types of values is what identifies certain cultures. And we have cultures in offices, you know. I'm a career defense counsel. There are cultures in the offices that I've been in between individuals who do misdemeanors and individuals who do felonies, you know. Individuals that do misdemeanors say, you know, felony people, they have all types of time to do whatever they need. We're the individuals who do it quick, so we got to make snap judgments because it's going fast. The felony say, you know, we do the serious stuff. You know, misdemeanors, they can afford to do it fast. We need to take our time. There's a culture that develops around those things because of what you do, how you do it, and the values that you hold. Every office has different cultures. And, you know, don't just look at this in terms of race and gender and things like that, but who you go out with to lunch may be a culture. Who you spend your social time with may be a culture. This is something that we all live with. One of the things about this study is that it impacts all of us. You know, it's not one racial group, not one gender group, but it impacts all of us. And all of us are involved with it. So it's something that deals with race, that may deal with skin tone. When I was growing up, there was even a thing between dark blacks and light-skinned blacks. It was really eating us up in our time, you know. So culture can revolve around a lot of things. We are over because the groundwork that has been laid by culture and the concept of culture and what that encompasses. And cultural competency is important. Now, some observations about that. First, some observations about Delaware. It's interesting to me that, you know, an organization that is obviously doing it right sees the need to do this. first time we went to a probation office to present this, that actually it would be a probation office that was having a lot of trouble and was sucking swamp water in terms of the decisions they were making. So it's interesting that somebody who's doing it well has a desire to do it better. Because there are some sectors of the criminal justice system who are not taking to the notions of cultural competency and things of that nature. So that's interesting. And it's interesting talking about the program. No, but first, let's talk about probation officers generally, and the reason why a career defense counsel feels that it's important to be here. My experience has been that whether it's problem-solving courts, whether it's improvement of the system, probation has always been the prime mover. Those differences in the system has always been the stakeholder that, quite honestly, has been the gauge for whether we go forward. It is popular in the defense community that in order for us to go forward, we're going to have to shrink the system. If we do that in an intelligent way, probation is going to have to be at the table. So it's not only important the relationship that you have with your offenders, it's also important your relationship that you have with other stakeholders. I've been involved with the APPA for a number of years, was a member while I was public defender's office. And that training prepares individuals to be those types of stakeholders. So it's interesting to be here and to present this to individuals who want to get better at this. Let me say a little bit about this particular concept that I'm about to unpack. When I was a second lieutenant in the Marine Corps, we went to human relations training. Everybody dreaded it. It was race relations. And in essence, they were teaching us that nobody's black, nobody's white, nobody's brown, everybody's green. Everybody dreaded it. Guys that there wasn't a lot of women there, guys that were white always felt like they went into that training with a target on their back, because they were going to be the bad guys. And a lot of the human relations, race sensitivity training that you go to since then, or have gone to since then, white guys come to the training with a target on their back. Many of the individuals that I work with didn't want to go because they said, I'm just going to be made to be the bad guy. I don't need that. The good thing about this training and this concept and unpacking it the way that it needs to be unpacked is that either nobody's the bad guy or we're all the bad guy. Because everybody has implicit bias. Everybody. And knowing about implicit bias can make you better at dealing with implicit bias. But because it's implicit, there may be things that you're not aware of. Because if it were things that you knew about, it would be explicit. So sometimes it takes an event, sometimes it takes something like this to make you realize that you've got biases you didn't know you had. What are the bases of those biases? Well, that's what unpacking implicit bias in this curriculum is all about. We talked about culture for so long, and the fact that there are so many cultures, and it goes wide and it goes deep, because it starts early on, developing the things that make us identify with other individuals in that culture. But before we get into that, let's deal with the objectives that we'll have. We'll go to the next slide. At the end of this, I expect that everyone will be able to describe the concept of implicit bias and know what it means, and social cognition, which is a big part of implicit bias. and discuss concerns and implications for the leaders of the criminal justice system. Remember, this is good for you and the people that you work with. It's good for you and the offenders that you work with, but it's also good for you and other stakeholders in the system. So it goes broad and it goes deep. So we're hoping that you will be able to do the things that some of us who are veterans in the criminal justice system for going on 30 years are expecting probation to come with. We're going to take a break from the slides for a while, and I'm going to walk you through this, and then we'll go through the slides quickly. And if individuals have questions then, or if you have questions as I go along, if something is not clear, it's very important that you stop me as soon as you have a question. If I can't get back on track, then maybe somebody else needs to be doing this, but I'm hoping that I'll be able to get back on track. But we need to answer those questions as soon as you have them. Implicit bias starts with what we will call schemas, because that's what they are called. Schemas is a human behavior that's developed early on. In the time that we're infants, we're exposed to certain things, to certain people, to certain environments that start to form what we're comfortable with. You notice that there are some babies that readily go to other people and some babies that don't. Well, a lot of that has to do with how those children are reared and what they're exposed to. And they start developing things that are good and bad based on what their parents give them and how their parents nurture them. Okay, so we go from the infant stage and they start to walk and they start to experience things. And they get a key from their parents and their surroundings, what things are good, what things are bad, what things are favorable, what things they like, but more importantly, what things their parents like, what gets approval from their parents. And they can tell from their parents and their surroundings and their environment what things are favorable and what things are not. So even at an early age, babies start to categorize things in terms of what's favorable and what's not, what's acceptable and what's not, what's good and what's bad. The same thing about people. Based on where a child is nurtured, they may only have contact with a certain race of people. Then they're going to be comfortable with that race of people. And they may be less comfortable with another race of people. So if an individual has grown up, like my roommate at the Naval Academy, I was the first black he ever had any conversation with. He was from Montana. You know, so what they're exposed to starts to develop things that are favorable, comfortable, things that are unfavorable or uncomfortable, and things that challenge them. So as they grow up, they are exposed to certain things. Now keep in mind that social psychology defines these things along the lines of preferences that people establish. And they're established during their younger years. And this is the reason why all of us have implicit biases, because we were all raised in certain circumstances that our parents felt were acceptable for us, comfortable for us, and it's normal that we establish preferences. And we need to do that because we have to negotiate during the course of a day hundreds of decisions, maybe thousands of decisions. So I'm jumping from infancy to us as an adult. If you had to think through all of the things that you have to do during the course of the day, it'd be pretty tedious. When you see a red light, what do? You have to think about that. When I need to stop my car, what do I do? You know, social psychologists describe that as social psychology establishes what's acceptable and what's not. These are shortcuts. And these schemas are shortcuts that we establish based on what we've been exposed to during our lives. Some of them are necessary. Some of these social psychology has established that these schemas or these shortcuts are necessary. There's a book called Blink. I forget who the author is. It goes at length to the advantages and the preference for social cognition over long, drawn-out thoughts about things. And I'll get into that a little bit more later on. So these schemas develop a body of practice for all of us, where we start to rely on these shortcuts, schemas, based on things that may have started when we were babies, little children. A lot of these shortcuts are good. It develops into social cognition, where we start to establish a body and a practice of things that we do unconsciously. Because this is social cognition, and this is implicit, which means that a lot of these things we don't even think about. When I have to stop my car, I don't think about hitting the brakes. There are certain things, when I'm hungry, I don't have to think about getting something to eat. If I pass by a water fountain and I'm thirsty, I don't have to really think about stopping to get a drink of water. There are certain things that we do that we can't think through. It's good. Now, here's a water fountain or a bottle of water. Should I take a drink of this? I'm thirsty. Should I take a drink of this? No, I'm thirsty. I see water. I'm going to grab the water and drink. The red light is the best example. There are a lot of red lights in our lives that we don't have time to think about whether or not we need to react to that. Hitting the brake when we need to hit the brake could mean the difference between life and death. A lot of the social cognition that we go through, a lot of the schemas that have developed to make up that social cognition are necessary, are good. But part of those schemas have to do with preferences for people. And part of our practice that develops is a social cognition and preferences in terms of stereotypes and attitudes for people. An example, black men are aggressive. Well, obviously that may make a difference when you're in a fight situation where you have to determine who is the aggressor and who's defending themselves. So these can play out in a lot of different ways in the same fight or in a different fight. If there's a man and a woman, well, somewhere in our social cognition, we view that physically women are weaker than men. Well, that's not always true. In my time in the military, some of the women who were Marines that I came up against could hold their own against anyone. But we developed these shortcuts because making the decisions about all of these things during the course of the day would make our day a lot longer, and it just can't work. So the mind works with these things by developing these shortcuts. And most of the time, these shortcuts serve us well. You know, you see an individual who's older, you know instinctively that you may have to relate to them in a different way. You see someone who's younger, you react to them in a different way. A lot of times that serves you well, but sometimes it doesn't serve you so well. And everybody is working from the same deck. Everybody has got these implicit biases, and if you knew about them, maybe you would correct them. And maybe if you knew about them, and I maintain that this is the truth, if you know about the fact that you have implicit biases, it can make you on guard. There are certain decisions that I go through now that I check myself, because I know that I have an implicit bias in that area. And I step back and I say, well, was that decision made because of this bias that I have established as an implicit bias, which means that I will act based on my background and areas that's not the best decision to make. Well, am I acting based on the fact pattern itself, or am I acting based on what I have been groomed to decide, like schemas and social cognition? Now, you can't live without it. You can't live without schemas. These shortcuts are necessary. And I've mentioned just a few of them, but social cognition is something that we live with, all of us, in order to live from one day to the next. That's the reason why all of us have got implicit biases. And it's important for you to know this, because it's not just a matter of community trust and perception in your decisions, but you deal with people as offenders who have implicit biases. Not only as law enforcement, not only as somebody who may be wanting to lock them up, but if you're white, they might also have implicit biases towards somebody who's white. If they're male, they might have implicit biases towards a female in law enforcement. You've got to be aware of the fact that the individuals that you deal with also have these implicit biases, because everybody has them. But I have found that knowing that they exist makes you more sensitive to the fact that your decision making should be based on certain things to keep you away from making decisions on implicit bias, so that your decision making can be fair and bias free. So there are a lot of authorities now, Blink was just the start of, that are regaling or celebrating the fact that social cognition helps us in ways that we can't begin to criticize, because we can't get by without it. But these are things that arm us to be able to identify the fact that everybody has these biases. Just that knowledge and understanding that alone, based on what we've covered with culture and cultural competencies, and the things that go into understanding the differences and being able to resolve cultural collisions of people who have different beliefs, ways of analyzing things, and backgrounds, helps us be able to check ourselves once we're familiar with these concepts, so that we can begin to discover about ourselves things that would otherwise be implicit. And we unearth these things. The good news is that we can deal with these. There is a way of identifying, there's a decision-making process that will help you step back and analyze your decisions to make sure that they are based on the facts and the individual who's in front of you, rather than implicit biases that you bring. Because you'll be able to do things like getting other things off your mind, so that you're clear to make a decision unaltered or unaffected by the many things that we have. Clear your mind to make sure that this is going to be your focus, and you unclutter your mind so that you can make a decision about this. And you make sure that there is some type of guideline that you use, a checklist, whatever you want to call it, some type of guideline that guides your decision-making process, whether it's best practices, whether it's evidence-based practices, whether it's your experience and the right way to do things, that you do it based on those things, rather than the race, the gender, or the orientation of the individual who sits in front of you. And I'm telling you, just knowing that this exists, knowing that this is the bias that everybody has to deal with, expands your horizon to the point that you can deal with it. And your implicit biases will become more explicit. And other individuals may not ever know that you're going through that checking process, but you'll be checking yourself to make sure that when you make a decision on whether or not this individual needs to go into certain types of services or needs to be violated, that you're making that decision based on the facts that are before you, the practices involved, rather than the implicit biases that you bring to the situation. And it's important for you to be able to relate to other individuals in that realm, because you're leaders. And the way you make decisions and how you not necessarily justify those decisions, but how you teach people how to make decisions speaks a lot of whether or not these biases are going to enter in. And I would say that knowing about implicit biases and what we bring, the fact that everybody has them, the fact that they are based on things that we cannot control because they were inlaid in us from the time that we were infants.